Good morning, and welcome to Positively Politics, the show where we break down the sometimes complicated and often negative world of politics in a straightforward and academically rooted way. My name is Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Indianapolis and the host of this show here on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. Now, if you've caught this show before, you know what I'm about to tell you, but that is that Positively Politics is all about asking questions, inciting conversations, bringing in historical context, data points, giving us, I hope, a richer understanding of just one of the political topics du jour. Understanding that there's a lot of stuff going on in politics every single week. I often feel overwhelmed by it, and I love it. This is what I do for a living. Really, the focus of this show is trying to break down one topic and give you a greater understanding of what's going on, providing the context, and really giving you a stronger sense of where we are and how you individually feel about that topic or those issues. And I want to add, before we jump into today's episode, that if you want to listen to this episode again, catch any of our old shows, or share with a friend, you can listen to Positively Politics anywhere you get your podcast. We have a podcast now available, pulling up old episodes and, of course, posting a new one every week, just like we do here on WICR at 11:30 on Saturdays. Let's just dive right into it. We're going to talk about the war in Iran because I have heard so much confusion, so much concern, and I think understandably so, in terms of our involvement, in terms of whether or not this is a war. And I am using that term. It has been used by the media, but we'll explain why it is technically a conflict, not yet a war. I also want to talk about conscription because last week there was a new announcement that would make conscription automatic for young men in our country and also bump the age up just by 1 year. So the limit now is 25, will be 26. How does that work? Then talk about public opinion on the war, which is pretty conflicted. And finally, how the war in Iran might impact the elections. I'll go ahead and give you the spoiler alert, but you're going to want all the dirty details. I don't think it's going to matter much in the primaries. Many states have had primaries. Of course, Indiana, we're coming up to our primaries in just a few weeks, right? But in the general election, especially when we look at that partisan divide, if we are still involved in Iran, it might have a really big impact in addition to gas prices in terms of election outcomes. So let's just dive right into it. Let's first of all just talk about conscription for a little bit, because this is really what got me into this topic in a way that I felt like I could contribute something that wasn't already out there. I'll go through where we are at this moment in our involvement in Iran, but it is changing constantly. I regularly get asked, as a political expert, what are we doing? And it's often my answer right now is unclear and inconsistent. Not the answer, I hope, but that's what I say because what we have been doing has changed. And understandably, that's really how national defense, foreign affairs works, but it does make it complicated to understand. But the thing that made me really interested in this topic for this week was the announcement last week of an expansion of conscription. And conscription in our country we think of as selective service. Of course, right now we do not utilize a draft. We don't require people to fight in the military, but we have done that at 6 times in our nation's history. And so we do have conscription so that in case it's necessary to have, if we have to utilize it, we do have it available. Now, those 6 times, because I just like this, if I heard someone say it, I want to know which ones, right? You're probably guessing. Be the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and then the Vietnam War. So we haven't utilized the selective service in terms of a required and obligatory draft since 1973. So yeah, it has been a hot minute. But there was an announcement that we would utilize automatic conscription. Okay? And doing this in part because we have the ability to. And this would automatically register young men as they turn 18. And right now, prior to the automatic element, you're required by law to register within 30 days of your birthday. But this would essentially modernize the Selective Service. But in addition to that, you would also expand the age. And so right now, the Selective Service in our country goes from age 18 to age 25. It would bump it up 1 year to 26. And one thing that I thought was fascinating as I was learning about this was the age in which we emphasize what age would be targeted first, selected first. I think those are the right terms here, I hope. Right? It would really start with the 20-year-olds of the year that the conscription, right, that the draft begins. And it would start with 20, then it goes 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, and now it will have the inclusion of 26 and then bump back down to the 18 and 19-year-olds, which I think is really fascinating. I want to put out there, too, that in terms of the draft and selective service, this still only applies to men in the United States. But we have seen countries like Norway and Denmark that 2 decades ago expanded their selective service to include women in that regard. The United States, women can serve in the military, but they're not included in terms of the draft. Now, I want to remind you that you're listening here to WICR 88.7 The Diamond. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson for Positively Politics. We're talking about, I like to say, war. What is it good for? And in this case, I will tell you, it can have a positive impact on the economy, but it can also have a negative impact in terms of elections. Not always. I do think it might in the case of the 2026 congressional midterms, though. But talking about the automatic registration, conscription, and the War Powers Act. Right now, we do not have an active draft. It's not something that we're utilizing. But as we talk about the involvement our country has in Iran, we recognize that anytime you send troops overseas, whether it's through a president's directive, as it is in this case, or it's a congressional declaration of war, and we'll talk about those constitutional powers here in just a second. However that turns out, if you run out of people who are volunteering and willing to go, that is when you ultimately have to support and supplement those troops with the draft. So these changes, I think, are very interesting to see. I will say I'm still surprised. First of all, that doesn't expand to include women. That would essentially double the amount of troops you have access to. But also the slight age increase to 26. And this is what I think is so fascinating about it, because I am not a scientist in terms of biology and understanding of human physiology, but I wonder, right, is 26 really the appropriate cutoff? Is there something about that special age range when we're talking about essentially 8 years from 18 to 26, right? Does something happen? Is 27 when your body starts to age in a way that would be detrimental to require people to have military service? I am well over 26. I'd probably be one of the last people you'd want on the battlefield. I'm more of a lover, not a fighter. And if it's fight or flight, I'm going to flight, and I'm not fast. I'm going to be dead, really. But I think about that as a really interesting demarcation. And when you think about it in terms of law and other things, a lot of times we designate 18 as you're an adult. You can be tried as an adult. You can consume certain products as an adult. In some cases, we increase that age. If we're talking about alcoholic beverages, for example, to 21. But we have different ages that sometimes feel somewhat arbitrary, but are obviously important markers. They're thresholds that say, at this point, you can do this. And at a certain point, you can no longer do this, as we're talking about in terms of the draft. Now, as we discuss the war in Iran, I want to remind you that it is not technically a war, but let's look back at those congressional powers. So as we say war in Iran, we can say, well, we are engaged in battles, we have troops overseas, but why is it not technically a war, as I alluded to earlier? Well, we look at our handy-dandy United States Constitution. If we look at the congressional powers listed in Article 1 and specifically outlined in terms of Section 3, Congress has the power formally and directly to declare war. Right? Even though we haven't seen a formal congressional declaration of war since 1941. Of course, that would be after Pearl Harbor. This was for World War II. And we know we have since been involved in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and now we're talking about Iran, right? That's still a congressional power, a congressional authority. And that rubs up from a constitutional perspective when we talk about separation of powers against Article 2, which covers executive branch power, and in particular, one of the formal powers of office that the president has, and that's the commander-in-chief. Because as commander-in-chief, a unilateral role, by the way, that the president has ultimate authority, right? Singular, that's why we said unilateral, authority over military strategy and operations. And these two things, I was talking about commander-in-chief under Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution giving executive powers to the president, but also Article 1, Section 8 under the U.S. Constitution that gives congressional authority to declare war. They do not have to be at odds with one another. And yet oftentimes it seems that is exactly the case. Now, I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson. You're listening here to Positively Politics on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. We're talking about war. What is it good for? Well, sometimes the economy, sometimes voting, though I'm not sure that's going to be the case for these 2026 congressional midterms. Right? But as we talk about what is it good for? Well, constitutional examinations, for one, as I'm describing the differences we see in terms of the congressional and the executive, the presidential powers. Now, we have seen through Congress twice now this year a War Powers Resolution Act. And typically you see a partisan divide that is going to this alludes to the public opinion polls I'm going to share with you later, right? If you say, well, generally speaking, do Americans approve or disapprove of what we're doing in Iran? Well, it depends on their party. Not exhaustively, not exclusively, but largely. Depends on their party, right? And use that as an example to say, well, do people support in Congress limiting what they see as an overreach of the president's authority in terms of foreign involvement? If they're Democrats, senators or representatives, they likely do, whereas Republicans are more likely to refrain from that. But I want to talk about what we consider to be kind of a gray area. I think what happens when under Section 2 of the Constitution, you do allow the president to serve as commander-in-chief, and there's certain inherent powers that the president has to help prevent and respond to attacks to our country. And at the same time, under Article 1, Section 8, we know the formal declaration of war belongs to Congress. And that's not to mention, right, being able to raise and support armies, controlling the funding for the military, provide and maintaining for a Navy. So again, needing to create funding renewals to support a Navy. These are all things that Congress does. And invariably, we could say, while they're not necessarily at odds, they don't have to be at odds. This can be kind of tricky when you have a president that wants to do one thing and Congress that wants to behave differently. So looking at the War Powers Resolution Act of 1973, I think provides us a helpful historical examination for understanding the differences between true war and a defensive action. Okay. The president has the constitutional authority and responsibility to provide for a defensive action. We need to protect our country. In a very specific term, you could say from a direct physical attack and threat. Right. So I am thinking now, go back to 1941, where Congress did eventually declare war after December 7th, Pearl Harbor attack, right? That would be a very clear example of also presidential power, except in this case, the president and Congress were on the same page. It didn't matter. But of that defensive action, right? We were attacked on American soil. We needed a response. And then the element of war, being able to formally declare war, belongs to Congress. Now, this is where I feel bad sometimes saying, well, the war in Iran. And yet we recognize that we're involved to a degree in this military combat that would feel diminished if we didn't say war. I'll tell you, sometimes I'm very careful about the words I use. Sometimes I think about, well, should we just refer to it as a conflict? right? But conflict can be very broad. It certainly encompasses war. It can encompass so many other things. And this is, again, one of the things I think is important if you revisit the War Powers Resolution Act, trying to establish the balance between the congressional authority we see in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution and the presidential power that we see listed in Article 2. So what it requires, essentially three key things. This is the War Powers Resolution Act of 1973. First, the president needs to consult with Congress in the language is every possible instance. So not a FYI item, not a, oops, sorry, forgot, but 2 weeks ago I did this thing, right? But, open doors, very clear. In every possible instance, Congress should be hearing from the president before troops are committed, sent overseas. Then there's the reporting piece. And so the president needs to notify Congress within 2 days, 48 hours of sending, committing, or verbally or otherwise, but sending armed forces to the conflict. And then finally, there's a time limit, right? There's a frame, 60 to 90 days is how long troops can be anywhere without congressional declaration of war. Right? And there are some specific statutory authorizations I'll provide for as well, but you basically have 60 to 90 days or else the troops need to come home. Now, a lot of times presidents have seen this as an unconstitutional overreach. They look at the War Powers Resolution Act of 1973 and says that's limiting the authority and powers they have as the commander-in-chief under Article 2. But from Congress's perspective, this prevents a president from sending troops overseas indefinitely and saying, no, it's not a war. We're just over there anyhow, right? We're doing something. It looks a lot like a war, but we're not calling it a war. Therefore, it's not a war. That's what the War Powers Resolution Act of 1973 is set to address, despite the fact that typically its interpretation from a president's perspective, and we've seen several subsequent presidents interpret it this way, as not being constitutional nor truly applicable to how they see their powers. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson. You're listening here to WICR 88.7 The Diamond. We're talking today about war, the Iran war, conscription. We're going to talk about public opinion and the impact on the election. I just want to remind you that if you want to catch this episode again, listen to the beginning. Maybe you just tuned in. If you want to catch previous episodes or share with a friend, Positively Politics is now on podcast. Wherever you listen to podcasts, I like listening on my phone when I'm driving or I'm taking the dogs for a walk. You can catch Positively Politics anytime. And I'll tell you, we're uploading old shows regularly. So another great opportunity to catch Positively Politics in addition to listening here on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. Now, I want to talk about public opinion involving the war, or you might say conflict in Iran, because I think this is one of the most important pieces of any foreign involvement. Right? And I want to start with a couple stipulations. And first and foremost, it's very important for you to know that generally speaking, Americans are not well educated, well versed, and not especially interested in foreign affairs. And that's writ large across the spectrum of public opinion. It doesn't matter what year it is, it doesn't matter the extent of the involvement. Just in general, Americans don't understand international relations to the same extent as they do domestic affairs. And to explain, I always feel like I have to defend us. But if you feel like you want to challenge us, you're like, that can't be right. That is so unfair. Why? Why would we be so ignorant? I don't think it's just ignorance. So obviously that's what I'm characterizing here. But understand, and I think this makes sense, right? It's easy to recognize politics and its direct impact on you when it is an unavoidable, explicit, obvious impact. So if you're paying for gas and you are human and look at how much the pump is right now, how much it's going to cost you per gallon, right? You'll notice, you'll see that. Right? But if it's something about where we're sending troops and you're not in the troops and you don't know the troops and that is not a part of your daily interactions, that won't be important to you. I think about it when I think about this show in particular. I try to focus on one key area because I myself, again, get overwhelmed by politics and I live and breathe this. But there's a lot of stuff going on. And it's certainly true for Americans in every regard, but especially in terms of politics. We recognize there's a lot going on. So just understand, typically speaking, Americans don't know a lot or pay a lot of attention in terms of foreign affairs. That said, whenever you frame something as a war, even though to our previous discussion, constitutionally, this is probably more of a presidential directive in a conflict. But for the war in Iran, people will care a little bit more. And I want to share data points from several polls that indicate a couple key factors. First of all, it's conflicted, right? So Americans do not all support or oppose, which is fairly typical, our involvement in foreign affairs broadly, and certainly in terms of the war in Iran. But in addition to that, there is a very clear partisan divide. And I think that's going to be really important when we say, well, why does public opinion matter? Well, oftentimes it's a proxy for an election, and this is an election year. That will absolutely matter in the general election. So let's start with looking at the data itself. So I want to talk about a poll from Quinnipiac. There's also a great AP NORC poll. And what they highlight here, many polls out there, essentially is the divide amongst Americans. And so for the Quinnipiac poll, for example, they noted that 54% of registered voters oppose the current military campaign, right? Our involvement, whether you call it a conflict or a war, a rose by any other name would still be awful because obviously people are dying here. But 54% of Americans oppose it. So that is the tiniest, smidge of a majority of Americans that oppose. I do want to clarify too, I say Americans, right? Specifically, this poll targeted registered voters. And you can understand from a polling perspective, why would they look at registered voters and not just Americans as a whole? Well, they're looking at the impact, right? What do they think this will mean for the election cycle? Now, I said 54 say they oppose. There were some that were non-answered, some that said they were not sure. 39%, so nearly 40, right? But 39% of registered voters said they supported the strikes in Iran. And so what that shows you is almost 40 to 50, right? There's a sizable amount of Americans, sizable number, 15% in this case, in this particular Quinnipiac poll, that don't know how they feel about things. And that, to me, feels pretty honest. 15% also in terms of this sort of conflict, especially given how politicized it's been, and it's an election year, and it's having a direct economic effect for Hoosiers, Americans, anyone who drives or purchases gasoline. I will say 15% feels about spot on, right? Maybe even a little high. You really don't have an opinion, but you see that divide. Now, I will say, one of the things we can look at is over time, and this is looking at several polls, so it's not a true panel study. A great panel study, by the way, will be looking at the same group of voters asking the same question over periods of time. And I'm looking at all of the data that I've seen collected in terms of reputable public opinion polling, but it does show a slight decrease in support for our involvement since we initially launched Operation Epic Fury, and that's the name of our conflict, our war that we're involved with in Iran. So since that initial involvement, the very end of February, and so we're talking about a little over a month and a half, you've seen a slight decrease in terms of support. And I want to remind you that you're listening here to Positively Politics on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson. We're talking today about war. What is it good for? And the public opinion polling right now in terms of our involvement, our conflict in Iran. And as we look at that polling, and especially the trend, the changes that we see, it does highlight what we call the rally around the flag effect in public opinion. And rally around the flag effect is best exemplified. I talked about Gallup presidential approval polls my last episode, right? They're no longer doing that, but you can look back at historical data. Best exemplified in October 2001. Who was President? George W. Bush. What was his approval number? I think 92, 93%. Very high, unusually high, but a great example of rally around the flag effect because that was right after 9/11. And the concept behind this It's like this psychological phenomenon, is the idea that if we're involved in a war, whether it is the war on terror or a conflict in the Middle East or Operation Epic Fury, our involvement in Iran, whatever it might be, that there's a tendency to say, you know what, united we stand, divided we fall. I may not like this president. I may not have voted for this president. I may not agree with the decision to get involved, but now we are, so we're going to stick it out, right? I think of it kind of like the avoiding divorce explanation amongst parents, right? Like we're in it for the kids. We agreed to this. And that's the idea. This is our president. And that's why you can see what we call a rally around the flag effect. Now, we'll add, we don't see this in the president's numbers. We don't see a change in terms of his support. But seeing that slight decrease from our initial involvement in Iran at the end of February to where we are now would suggest that there was initially more support to stand by your man, if you will, to support the president and this involvement, and that has decreased over time. Now, I'm going to connect this to why do I think it's decreased? Are Americans suddenly much more aware of what's going on in Iran? Are they paying attention to, let's talk about what happened this past weekend. The vice president, J.D. Vance, was in talks for negotiations. Ultimately, those failed. And earlier this past week, you had the Strait of Hormuz that was under a blockade, very high tensions about whether or not our country would allow ships to go through and the extent to which they were able to do that. That's where we are at this moment. So again, to go back to my earlier characterization, that is unclear and inconsistent what our game plan is, what's our exit strategy, right? But to that point, in terms of why public opinion has likely dropped, in part because it's not clear what we're doing, but also in part because the direct hit. And this is where public opinion is going to influence election results, which is going to be impacted by our involvement specifically in Iran, and that's gas prices. Gas prices tie it all together, right? There's that famous political line, it's the economy, stupid. I don't think anyone's stupid. Everyone knows it's the economy. Because when you pay for gas and you see that it's $4 whatever, starts with a 4, that's too high of a number for me per gallon for gas. And you remember when it was low 3s, even high 2s, right? And just a few weeks ago, I think that is a very clear demarker, especially for the American voter who may not otherwise know or care what our involvement is internationally, but sees that as a direct impact economically on their lives. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson. You're listening here to Positively Politics on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. We're talking about war, what is it good for, as we wrap up our conversation this Saturday morning. And I want to tell you that when we're looking at the public opinion polling, I do think this is something that will impact the election and likely a negative reflection for the Republican Party as a whole. The president is not on the ballot. But oftentimes we see congressional midterms as a referendum of sorts on the president. And typically the party in power fares poorly in congressional midterms, and that would be the Republicans. This is likely not going to be a winning strategy for them. I mentioned the public opinion approval showing a difference in terms of political party, and you likely already anticipated this, but the Republicans are the strongest supporters, right? Edging between 85 to 90% of Republicans say they support our involvement in Iran, whereas Democrats are almost completely opposed to it, 90% saying they disapprove. So you see a very clear difference. Most Republicans supporting it, most Democrats opposing it. And this, of course, will play out at the polls. But I also think the longer it goes, the higher the gas prices go, or even stabilizing at 4, just not a comfortable number for the American consumer. Not when just a few weeks ago you were in the 3s. That will have an impact. That is going to be something that voters see and think of. And one last thought to this, when we say, what is war good for? Sometimes you have the rally around the flag effect. Sometimes that means it's really helpful. It brings the country together. But it can also serve to further divide. If it's not clear why we're involved, if not everyone agrees on that mission, that objective, that explanation for involvement, then you don't see just an automatic rally around the flag. You're not going to just see patriotism sweep up every angle. That's one of the things that's really important, I think, when we consider the war in Iran. And I would highlight, emphasize, underline, put an asterisk by it, whatever you want to do. But truly, the inconsistent and unclear measure of this war. I recognize what we're doing, what we're trying to get out of it. But given the failure of talks, now you have people that are tactical negotiators coming in and really addressing these negotiations from a more detailed perspective. But since they haven't been successful yet, I think that is part of what complicates this as a public opinion issue and what makes it potentially very volatile, an election cycle that will likely already favor one party over the other because of other demographic features of this particular election. I want to thank you for tuning in and remind you that you can catch this show wherever you get your podcasts and here every Saturday for WICR 88.7 The Diamond. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson.